Hello and welcome to Matrix Live. Is this actually a Matrix Live? I don't know. You can suggest new names in the comment. This is a new episode in our tutorial series to get a shiny home server deployment during the holidays. In the previous episode, we wanted to get a good idea of how modern deployments work, and we did a hands-on deployment to understand each and every piece of it. It was a manual and cumbersome process. In this episode, we're going to redo a clean deployment with Ansible and see what else needs to be done to have a safe deployment in the long run. Of course, we take the assumption we're starting from a fresh, clean, vanilla server. A disclaimer: the playbook we're going to use is maintained by the community and is not endorsed or supported by the matrix.org Foundation. It's a convenient way to deploy a home server and services, but the matrix.org Foundation does not monitor nor audits this playbook. So, explaining Ansible in a minute. It's software on your administration workstation, that is, your laptop, and there's nothing on the server side. Ansible is going to automate your actions. It's going to connect to your remote server over SSH and play some commands for you. To know what commands it needs to play, it will read a playbook. To know on which server to execute the commands, it will read an inventory. And to know whether it needs to execute all the playbook or only some tasks inside it, it relies on host variables, which is a fancy name for configuration files, but also on tags. Playbooks are not just bash scripts, but an actual syntax developed for Ansible. One key benefit is that a single playbook can be translated into commands for different servers running different distributions. Additionally, it allows Ansible to give you a consolidated status of how executing the whole playbook went. So what are we going to deploy? The playbook is already provided by the kind administrators contributing to matrix-docker-ansible-deploy. We will need to write the inventory, which is going to be real quick and straightforward for us given we only have a single server. We will also write the configuration file for our setup and ask Ansible to play the playbook with a certain set of tags depending on what we're doing. This is what we had set up manually last week. And this is what the playbook is going to set up for us this week. This is a Nginx server in a container to do the reverse proxying, a certbot container to retrieve the certificates for the services we want. Both Nginx and the certbot are going to do what Traefik did in the previous episode. That is reverse proxying and certificates renewal. The playbook is also going to deploy a Synapse instance in a container, an element instance in a container, a turn server, roughly what connects peers together when doing a matrix native call, a Postgres database not in a container, a Prometheus instance in a container to collect data about Synapse, a Grafana instance in a container to display it in fancy dashboards, and finally systemd services to schedule the above and keep those services alive in case of a sometimes unexpected reboot. You might remember the files we needed to serve for the delegation of incoming traffic last week. We're still going to serve them today, but the Nginx reverse proxy is going to serve them directly. So what do we need to get started? Same as last week. We need a domain name. I took mine from gandhi.net, Gandi.net, a VPS, and I took mine from netcup.eu, a cheap and reliable German provider. And we're going to assume you have installed Ansible on your admin workstation. You also need to set up key-based authentication on your server. If you're not familiar with it, you can look up ssh-copy-id on any search engine. So let's do it. This is the architecture we're going to deploy, and those are the domain names we need to set up. The two on the right are A records. They translate the domain name into the IP of our server. The two on the left are CNAME records. You could consider them like domain redirections. We could set them as A records to the same IP of the server, but using CNAME allows us to do less work if we ever decided to move to another server. We're not going to cover how to add those records to your domain name, and we're going to assume you have done it. So we can actually get started. So if you look up matrix-docker-ansible-deploy in most search engines, you should stumble upon the right repository. So we're going to do just that. Matrix-docker-ansible, writing is hard, typing is hard. Ansible-deploy. The first link is the right repository. So this is the one I'm going to clone on my local computer, which contains the playbook and from which I'm going to create the inventory and host variables. But this repository also has a nice documentation on how to use it, the install guide. So first, let's scroll up and copy the link. I can go to my terminal, go to my projects folder. I'm going to git clone this repository, and I can go inside this repository. Okay, so this is the same as I have on the repository on GitHub. Then I'm going to go to the installation section, which is very clear. The table of contents has many things, so the prerequisite is something you need to read before getting an OS installed on your VPS to make sure that you have an OS that is compatible with the playbook. Configuring the DNS server is something that we have done previously. This is what we have explained in the latest slides, and we just got the playbook source code. So we are going to move to the configuring the playbook section of the documentation. And it's fairly straightforward. We have a few steps we need to follow. The first one is to create a directory to hold the configuration, which corresponds to our domain. We need to copy the configuration file, edit it, do the inventory, edit it, and finally we can move with installing. So let's go back to our terminal. So I'm going to inventory host vars. It's empty, so I'm going to create matrix.chipchop.org as I'm being told, and I'm going to go inside that directory. Then I'm going to copy the example file, which is in examples vars. If you are not familiar with the syntax you are seeing on the terminal, the double dot means parent directory. So I can copy this file here, I can edit the vars, and I'm simply going to edit the matrix domain here. So my bare domain name is chipchop.org. I'm going to install the Synapse home server. We could install Dendrite, which is another matrix home server. I really like stability, so I'm going to go with Synapse, which is the flagship, I would say, home server implementation. Then I need to generate secrets for my home server. I'm being suggested to use pwgen, so password gen, to generate a password. So I'm just going to do that in another terminal, and I'm going to paste it here. I can save my file. Do I have anything else I want to edit? Yes, the email address for the administrator. So if you remember from last week we had Traffic, which was retrieving certificates from an authority called Let's Encrypt for us, and we provided an email address so we can be warned in case something goes wrong. We are not using Traffic this week, we are using certbot, but certbot is going to retrieve certificates from Let's Encrypt as well. So we need to provide an email address in case something goes wrong with certbot, and Let's Encrypt can warn us and tell us that the certificate is going to expire soon. So I'm providing admin@chipchop.org. Obviously, you want it to be a real email address that you actually monitor. And a Postgres password to use for the super user Postgres user called matrix by default. I'm going to just run the same command again to generate a complex password, and I'm going to enter it here. Just a word of warning here. This is something that might shock a few of you. There are passwords and tokens in plain text in the Ansible file. This is not something I do for my personal instance. I'm going to keep doing it for the sake of simplicity here, but I'm not going to cover in detail how to do it more properly. If you want to have a look at how to do it more properly, I recommend you to have a look at Ansible Vault. So Ansible Vault is sort of Docker Compose, but for Ansible. Little mistake here, it's the equivalent of Docker Secrets, not Docker Compose. Okay, so I can save my file. Then the documentation tells me that I have edited the configuration file. I need to copy the sample inventory host file. All right, back to my terminal. I need to go to the inventory, copy examples/hosts, and copy it here in my inventory directory, and I can edit the hosts file. So it's telling me that it's explicitly asking for my server external IP address because of Coturn, blah, 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 blah. Not much we need to read in detail here. Basically, we need that our server is going to be matrix. In my case, chipchop.org. In your case, whatever your domain is. Ansible host is going to be my IP address. Okay, so the IP address of my server. I'm going to retrieve it from my notes. Here it is. So I can copy it. And I allow Ansible to run as root on my server. So nothing too fancy here. All right, I can save it, get back to the documentation, and oh yes, I'm just going to add another line. I'm going to need you to trust me for this one. Here it is. I'm going to go back to the configuration of my host. So back to my terminal, host vars, and for my home server, I want to add one line of configuration. I need you to trust me. This matrix nginx proxy base domain serving enabled true is the line I add to tell nginx to serve the files needed for the delegation of incoming traffic. If you want to know where to find it in the doc, it's actually a bit later in the doc. We can carry on with installing. So it's going to be step 5. You have configuring service discovery via well-known. So this is where you can find this configuration option. Anyway, in my case, I'm just going to ask Ansible to do all the installation. So I'm just going to copy this command Ansible playbook -i inventory hosts. I'll just make sure I'm at the root of my project. I'm going to paste that command Ansible playbook, and I'm going to ask it to set up all the services. So here we have the prompt, because this is the first time I'm connecting through SSH to my home server. So I've got the fingerprint discovery. I'm prompted to verify the fingerprint, and then Ansible gets started and does the actual deployment. All right, we're going to leave Ansible a bit of time to do all it needs to do. Okay, after a bit of editing, so I left Ansible to play all its tasks. It was not very interesting for you to watch them happen in real time on my computer. So I just skipped that. It can take a little time. So don't worry, don't panic. It's not that things are frozen. It can take some time. At this stage, we should have a basic nginx reverse proxy in front of a Synapse instance. We should also have element in a container behind the same reverse proxy. a Postgres database that Synapse relies on, and a turn server. So those services are installed but not started. We can instruct Ansible to start them with the following command that I'm going to copy to my terminal. It's basically the same command, but instead of the setup all tag, we have the start tag. So Ansible is going to try to start the services. Here again, it's quite verbose because it's skipping a lot of tasks that we are not interested in. Right, it seems to be starting the things. Just making sure that services are started. Okay, and everything seems to have started. So now is a good time to check if on chipchop.org it's actually serving something. Okay, wonderful. So I can see that it's actually serving something on chipchop.org, and we can give a try to element.chipchop.org and see that actually I have Element running on my own home server. So it's completely mine. It's not related to matrix.org or the matrix.org foundation at all. It's entirely running on my infrastructure. If we try to sign in and if we try to create an account, it's going to tell us that registration has been disabled for the same reason as last week. We try to keep a healthy matrix ecosystem in which all new home server cannot be used as spam relays. So we need to register a new user. We can do that in a simple command. I'm taking from the playbook documentation. I'm going to paste that command, which we are going to edit together to understand what is happening. So the command is ansible playbook -i inventory host. To tell it we are going to do that on our home server. Setup.yaml is the name of the Ansible playbook, and we are going to use extra vars, which are the username and password we want for a user. So in my case, I'm going to be Tib, and my password is going to be a bad password you shouldn't use. And same as last week, I don't want to be a home server administrator, because if my access token was leaked, I want to limit as much as possible the damage that can be done. So I don't want to be an admin. This can be changed later. And we're going to finally use the tags register user. So Ansible is going to create the user for me. Here again, you can see it's very verbose because it's skipping a lot of tasks. It has registered a user. We can see it changed the status because the user was registered. And I'm getting back prompt. So I can sign in using my username and bad password you shouldn't use. Don't save my password, Firefox, please. Yes, allow data in persistent storage, obviously. And here I am. I'm going to enable desktop notifications, and I do have, I'm logged in on my Synapse on my own element. So that's fantastic. But that's not everything. It's important to understand what is happening on your server at a glance, and for that, formidable team behind Synapse also created great Grafana dashboards. If you're not familiar with it, Grafana is a piece of software capable of displaying information visually with very nice widgets to show you what is happening. To be able to do so, it needs another component which is called Prometheus to collect data regularly from the service it monitors. So the playbook will handle all the heavy lifting. We only need to tell it that we are interested in having Prometheus installed and collecting the data, and Grafana to display them. We are going to give it credentials we want to use to access it. Those are not the same as the matrix credentials. Those are completely different. Here again, use Ansible Vault. Using Ansible Vault would make sense. I'm not going to use it for the sake of simplicity. So I'm going to add some lines. I think it would make sense for me to show you where in the documentation you can find that. Maintain your servers. This is not here. So if you go to the docs of the README, you can find it's maybe in installing additional services. Here, I think that's here. Additional useful services, you can set up enabling metrics and graphs. So Prometheus graph now for your matrix server. That's here, and that's where I got the lines I'm adding to the vars. So back to the terminals. I'm going to the inventory, post vars, matrix.chipjob.org. I can edit my vars. So I'm going to the bottom of the file, and I'm just going to tell it that I want to have Prometheus enabled, and that I want to have graph now to display things. I want to log in as Tib, and my admin password is do you believe I use strong passwords. Obviously, you don't want to give your password to everybody in the wild like I am doing. Fortunately for me, this is a disposable deployment for me. And I'm not going to use Docker. I'm going to use the same Ansible playbook -i. As a good practice, I'll always get back to the root of the project. So Ansible playbook -i inventory posts. We're going to use the setup.yaml playbook, and we're going to use the tags setup, setup all. I never let's see that in the documentation. Do docs readme installing, and the tags are setup all. Okay, setup all, and I'm going to ask it not only to set up everything but also to start services as well. So I just add comma start, and Ansible is going to do both setup and starting the services. Here again, you did not really need to see Ansible doing all this output because it can take some time. You can see some errors at the end of this playbook. It's not necessarily an issue. It can be that the Postgres exporter takes some time to start. But we can now try to browse stats.chipjob.org in my case, or whatever your domain is in your case, to try to authenticate. I can see a login page, which is a good news because I did not want everybody to be able to gather data and statistics about my home server. So I'm going to log in using the password I set up that I have completely memorized and I completely remember, and I am totally not copying and pasting from the file I have set up. So you can see the dashboard with various metrics. As you can see, the CPU usage is very low, the memory usage is quite low here as well, which makes sense because the home server was just born. It's not yet really communicating with the rest of the federation because I did not start to use it. But if you try to join a large room, you should see memory usage increasing a little. But we will get to capacity planning maybe another time. Of all the dashboards, the one you will probably be the most interested in are the per block metrics. Those are interesting to understand what can be making your server slow. Is it, for example, because your database is hammered too much, in which case you need to increase the cache? Is it because you're trying to send many messages to the federation and your server can't keep up, in which case you probably need an additional worker? This is where you will be able to determine that. If you don't know what a worker is, don't worry, we will probably talk about that in a next episode, in a next tutorial episode, to see how to scale Synapse. Right. We're not going to set backups for this tutorial because the video would be way too long, but the playbook itself has some tasks dedicated to setting up backups. While they are not strictly needed for day-to-day operations, backups are still strongly recommended. Hardware failures and incidents can sound like very distant threats, but in March 2021, a data center caught fire in France, and people who didn't have offsite backups completely lost their data. So if your home server is just for fun, you can do without, but if you intend to rely on this home server for some more serious messaging, you should definitely set up backups. Have a look at the documentation, which is very clear. If there is a strong demand for it, we may do a follow-up episode on how to set up backups with this setup. Let us know in the comments if you're interested in such an episode. Another important aspect of server management is keeping up with the releases of the software so you don't end up with a completely outdated server. Synapse has a quite fast-paced release cycle, so if you keep up with Synapse releases, you should be able to keep your deployment up to date. Indeed, the people maintaining this playbook are updating it regularly. Here again, disclaimer, the matrix.org Foundation is not monitoring what they are doing. You can check the changelog.md file at the root of the Docker-Ansible-deploy repository to make sure they did not introduce any breaking change that needs manual intervention before performing any update. In any case, you should check that file regularly and pull the repository also regularly before running the setup and start command again to update your services. Finally, I strongly recommend you to read the maintenance documentation from the repository, as well as it's full of good advice that you should be following. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that you will have a nice, clean and safe home server. See you around, Matrix Live.